One thing has never changed throughout history: pooping. It was pretty easy for those living in the countryside who could just go squat behind a bush. Things were a little different in the more urban areas though. Those who had enough money could afford themselves a personal privy, but for the common people, answering the call of nature in a public space was prohibited. In 1339, a small child who was begging was killed on a London street by a cart as he squatted to take care of his business. In the public records, he was described as a savage. So what did the medievals do when they needed to introduce the brown trout to the pond? Being a cunning woman might have got you thrown in the stocks or the local duck pond back in the day, but there's a reason why they were popular. We can all do with an impartial outside voice to help us find clarity when we're feeling lost or stuck in a tricky situation. Today's sponsor, Purple Garden, specializes in connecting you with advisors who won't sugarcoat things, just give you the insight to make the right decision. Purple Garden helps connect you with talented psychic, tarot, and astrology advisors who are all vetted and voted for by people like you. All you have to do is create an account and then you can choose from hundreds of advisors. And you can change advisor each time depending on what you need. Each advisor has a short video message where they introduce themselves and talk about their experience, which makes it really easy to choose the right advisor for you. You can also choose whether you'd rather connect via text, phone call, or video call. If you're looking for clarity, go to purplegarden.com/medievalmadness or scan the QR code that's on screen and use my promo code medievalmadness to get your first deposit of $10 matched and start finding some answers. Speaking of deposits, let's get into today's video on medieval toilets. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Dropping a royal load. In most medieval castles, which did not have the luxury of modern indoor plumbing, the toilet was known as a garderobe or privy chamber, a sort of Middle Ages bathroom. The word garderobe originally described an area for storing clothes and valuables. Funnily enough, the two functions went well together because the ammonia from urine would help to discourage moths and mites. Garderobes were small single latrines and usually had chutes beneath so the waste could fall directly into a pit. The pit was emptied from outside of the castle building. Usually the garderobe would be built to jut out directly over the moat, so you can imagine the stench and the parasites that gathered around the area on hot sunny days. Toilets usually had small passageways that led to them, often with a right-angled turn for more privacy. There might even be 2 or 3 loos together all sharing the same chute, some were separated by walls, and some were more open plan. Similarly, some would have the luxury of being fitted with a wooden door, whilst others were more scenic. Another place to find a lavatory in a castle was in the corner of the Great Hall for the convenience of guests when banquets were held. A wooden bench covered the shaft hole and would form the seating area. Grass, hay or moss would be used as toilet paper. In the 12th century, a fire had almost broken out in the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds when a candle had burnt too close to some toilet hay in the abbey's privies. Some garderobes were windowed and scattered with rushes and scented flowers to help mask the smell and deter vermin. Despite these preventions, it is easy to see how a castle lavatory would have absolutely stank. So much so that King Henry III, who ruled England during the 13th century, mentioned the problem in a letter to his castle constable when he ordered a complete refit of the facilities at the Tower of London. He wrote, quote, "Since the Privy Chamber in London is situated in an undue and improper place, wherefore it smells badly, we command you on the faith and love by which you are bounden to us, that you in no wise omit to cause another Privy Chamber to be made, in such more fitting and proper place that you may select there, even though it should cost £100, so that it may be made before the feast of the translation of St. Edward, before we come thither." Sprinkle your tinkle. Those who were lucky enough to live by the sea, such as the monks at Portchester Castle in Hampshire during the 12th century, had stone chutes that went directly into the water and carried the sewage out to sea. At Dover Castle in Kent, Henry II made sure that all of his business needs were catered for. He had his ensuite facilities built just off the main bedchamber. Henry would have probably had a groom of the stool, who would have been responsible for helping his master have a comfortable experience during his toilet time and was also there to wipe his bum. Goodricke Castle has one of the earliest examples of an indoor toilet system in England. There is a whole tower devoted to growing a monkey's tail. Goodricke was replaced by a stone keep in the middle of the 12th century and then expanded during the late 13th to provide luxurious living quarters. The tower has 3 individual toilet chambers with fabulous views over the Herefordshire countryside. Like many castles, the latrines had deep shafts that dropped waste into a common cesspit. This then drained through a hole into the moat. The garderobe and moat also acted as a security barrier against any invaders. Let's face it, who would want to try and scale the walls directly below a privy shaft or wade through a moat full of sewage? Although during one siege at Chateau Gaillard in 1204, the French did just that. They crawled up inside one of the garderobe chutes and managed to capture the castle's middle bailey. Gaillard was built by Richard I at the end of the 12th century, and after the siege a stone wall was built around the shaft exit to prevent any repeat of this stunt. When King Henry III ordered new toilets to be built at Guildford, England, the Clerk of Wokes commanded bars to be fitted to the outlet of the chute to stop this happening there. In what was possibly one of the worst jobs ever invented, a tiny human plunger child was occasionally sent in to clean the cesspit and make sure the hole was not blocked. The toilet tower was built in the later Middle Ages to replace a small single latrine and is quite rare, as is the urinal that can be found at Orford Castle in Suffolk. Henry II built Orford as a show of royal strength to guard over the busy port. The senior royal official there, who was in charge of the castle and known as a constable, had his own personal urinal in his private chambers. It was built into the thick walls of the castle. Filling the bowl. There were also communal toilets at many medieval monasteries which were called reredautors or necessariums for obvious reasons. At Muckley, a Benedictine abbey in Somerset, England, a thatched 2-storey building was available. The monks entered from their dormitory on the level with the first floor, and there was a sewer channel below. Each toilet seat had a partition between them for privacy. At one Augustinian friary in Cambridge, archaeologists tested the skeletons of monks buried in All Saints Cemetery and found that many of them were infested with intestinal worms. This is despite the monastery having toilet blocks and hand-washing facilities. Researchers believe it could be because the monks used their own feces to manure crops in the friary garden. A 1361 manuscript written by John Stockton shows that the medievals were aware of parasitic worms and suggests some remedies. Remedies such as bitter medicinal plants like aloe and wormwood mixed with honey and other sweet things to disguise the taste. Simon Wells, a Franciscan monk, recommended mixing a drink made with powdered mole in the 15th century manuscript The Table of Medicine as an alternative cure. Laying dumplings. It wasn't until the very late 16th century that a flushing toilet was patented by Sir John Harrington, Queen Elizabeth I's godson. But the royals didn't like it and preferred to have someone empty their chamber pots for them instead, so flushing didn't really catch on until much later in the mid-19th century. Similarly, for most commoners who lived in the countryside, a chamber pot was stored under the bed or a bucket in the corner was used that could be emptied outside. Privies might be built with rows of seats over an earth closet or cesspit in sheds, and cesspits would need to be dug out, and they also needed to be regularly emptied and cleaned to prevent vermin and flooding. In some areas, public toilets were often constructed from wood and stone and built directly above rivers so that the water could carry the waste away. And for those living in a more urban environment, chamber pots were also the go-to for anyone who needed to answer the call of nature. For those with money, a commode chair might be used. This was a portable device that could be moved from room to room and consisted of a chair with a hole in the seat and a pot underneath to catch the feces and urine. Whatever the means of waste disposal, pot, bucket, private or public loo, the excrement had to go somewhere, and in some places chamber pots were often emptied out into the street. In towns and cities, the management of public latrines was a problem, and the throwing out of human waste onto the street was prohibited and punished with fines. The resident of one apartment building in London in 1421 resorted to throwing their waste out of the windows because they were, quote, deprived of a privy. They would have benefited from communal toilets called backhouses that were sometimes built at the rear of shared buildings, although these latrines could be dangerous if not maintained properly. As seen in 1326 when Richard Le Racre was in the middle of releasing the Krappen and the planks on the toilet gave way and he fell into the cesspit below and drowned. Draining the lizard. Sometimes it was just easier to go and pee outside, whether it be behind a statue, in a public fountain, or behind a bush. Of course, weighing in the street was much easier for men than for women. Many men would just find a quiet side alley to urinate, but even that had its problems. In 1307, one of the king's grooms, Thomas Scott, got into an altercation with 2 local men in London when he was caught relieving himself. They insisted that it would be more decent to go to the common privies of the city. Public toilets became a necessity with the ban on relieving oneself in public. In medieval documents, they were often referred to as siege houses. In 1301, a law was passed in York, England, that public toilets had to be made available in all 4 wards of the city. One of the earliest public loos was founded in the 12th century by Matilda, widow of King Henry I. They were located on the edge of a busy area of the River Thames. Gates and marketplaces were often chosen as the most logical sites because of their crowdedness. People sat in close proximity to one another with no privacy in public latrines. One medieval lavatory in Cheapside, London had 128 seats in 2 rows of 64, 1 row for men and the other for women. It was known as Whittington's Longhouse because it was built with money bequeathed by the famous Lord Mayor Dick Whittington. Although not London's first public loo, it was the first with separate facilities for different genders. By the 15th century, there were dozens of these amenities in London, often placed over bridges where the waste could just drop into the water below. The wardens of London Bridge spent £11 on building a privy in 1382. In York, the latrines over the River Ouse were known appropriately as pissying holes, and were also maintained by wardens. They were responsible for cleaning and repairing public toilets throughout the city. In Norwich, the treasurers laid out a substantial amount of money in 1411 to scour and make new the loos at the fish market and the neighbouring Guildhall. In the 1450s, over £10 was spent on sorting out the gutters of another lavatory nearby. Toilets in the Middle Ages were a primitive affair, and their biggest downside was the fact that there was no real way to avoid the unholy stench. For us, it's easy to look back and laugh at the medievals when we have efficient and modern lavatory facilities. For most people, the disposal of our sewage is something that we can take for granted. For the medievals, they did the best they could with the knowledge that they had. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week for another video. Have a great week. Cheers.